Good morning, everyone, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the second and the final day of our 13th edition of the Arctic Future Symposium, organized by the International Polar Foundation and our partners that I mentioned yesterday. Many thanks to them. We look very much forward to your questions and an interactive day today. Yesterday was half a day. Today we have 4 sessions and 2 keynote speakers that I will introduce you in a bit. There's one housekeeping request I was asked to transmit to you is please do not bring in food or drinks in this room. We have a pause after each of the panel sessions, so that I hope should be sufficient for you to drink today. So yesterday we had some interesting exchanges on the topics of governance and Arctic cooperation and research in turbulent geopolitical times, and whether the role of the stakeholders in the Arctic event is evolving. A constant element I noticed, and I know everybody noticed, is the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And while, of course, that is an undeniable fact and a factor that influences many aspects of what is going in the Arctic, and definitely probably will also be mentioned in the 2 first panel debates this morning, it is also my hope that today we put as much emphasis on other elements, other factors that are the pulse of the Arctic, namely youth, environmental initiatives, innovation and entrepreneurship, just to name a few. So today I said we have 4 panel discussions, and before diving into the panel discussions, I would like to invite Mr. Lars Haltbrekken, the chair of the Arctic Delegation of the Norwegian Parliament, for the first of our 2 keynote speeches this morning. Mr. Haltbrekken.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for giving me this opportunity to start day 2 of this year's Arctic Futures Symposium. I would like to start to take you back to 1988. I was then 17 years old. I read the news about acid rain and the hole in the ozone layer. Forests were dying because of pollution. All this made me, as a 17-year-old boy, worried about the future, but I believe that if we stood together, if we fought these problems together, we would be able to solve them. So I became a member of an environmental youth organization back in Norway. And I worked with the environmental movement for many years before I became a member of the Norwegian Parliament. And today, my children, they don't have to worry about neither acid rain or the hole in the ozone layer. These problems are gone. We solved them. But today, hardly a day goes by without fresh news on how climate change is dramatically changing our planet. All around the world, countries are experiencing floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, and other extreme weather events. But I believe, still, as I did when I was 17 years old, that we can solve the climate crisis if we have the will and stand together. Some years ago, I met a woman called Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Sheila is an Inuit. For the first 10 years of her life, Sheila was raised traditionally, traveling on the land by dog sled. When I met her, she was the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. She traveled around the world speaking about the right to be cold, explaining how the Inuits' traditional way of life, their culture, was threatened by global warming. How could they continue hunting on the ice when the ice was gone? Sheila talked about global warming from a human rights perspective. In Norway, we see the same challenges for the Sami people. Their culture is also being threatened by global warming. More and more of the grazing areas for the reindeers are now covered by trees, and the fluctuation in temperatures have created layers of ice in the snow, which makes it harder for the reindeer to dig through the snow and get the food. However, the Sami faces other challenges too. Some of the solutions to the climate crisis harm their culture and their reindeer areas. areas they are dependent on for reindeer herding. 1 year ago, the Norwegian Supreme Court ruled that permission to give that was given for 2 of the wind farms in Norway was illegal. The Supreme Court concluded it breached the Sami people's human rights. To face the challenges ahead, we must build on solutions that respect the rights of our indigenous people and use the knowledge that they have developed over thousands of years. We need more renewable energy, but we cannot build it in a way that breaks the human rights. Dear friends, the official Arctic Parliamentary Cooperation has, like the Arctic Council, been suspended because of Russia's invasion and war in Ukraine. We have started with informal meetings called by the chair of the Arctic parliamentarians, Ms. Aya Chemnitz, who is a member of the Danish Parliament elected from Greenland. The Arctic parliamentarians had an informal gathering in Nuuk in September and are planning to meet again early next year, most likely in the US. All meetings are without Russian participation. The main reason for having informal meetings is the dramatic developments in the Arctic. Simply, they do not stop our cooperation completely. Together, we need to mobilize people in our common struggle to give them hope and belief that they need to combat the climate crisis. Because the one thing I fear more than climate change is a misguided belief in fate. That we get overwhelmed by the changes and fall into the trap of thinking that this is something we cannot do anything about. But we can, if we want to. We know what the problem is. We have the technology to fix it. We can afford it, and there is still time. All we need is the political leadership. Dear friends, climate change was not created by the 4 million people living in the Arctic, but by the sum of activities of the 8 billion people living on planet Earth. Therefore, the global climate crisis cannot be solved in the Arctic, but by a global common effort. But in addition to a global agreement, we need regional initiatives to curb global warming. The Arctic Cooperation has done vital work to map out the emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, such as black carbon in the Arctic. There are several major sources of black carbon: industry, wildfires, shipping, and emissions from the burning of hydrocarbons. Black carbon absorbs solar radiation and heats surrounding air when suspended in the atmosphere. And by reducing the reflectivity of Earth's surface, when deposited on snow, ice, and other surfaces, it accelerates the melting and the warming process. Action on short-lived climate pollutants complements mitigation of long-lived greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. Cutting black carbon emissions will have more immediate impact on the melting of snow and ice compared to CO2, which stays in the atmosphere for many decades. We also know that regional cuts have regional effects. This means that if we manage to cut emissions in the Arctic, this will reduce Arctic climate change. Furthermore, we know that reduced emissions will be good for human health. There are around 1,500 off-grid communities in the Arctic, which means that they are not connected to the national electricity system. The main energy source for most of these communities is diesel for producing electricity. For me, it's essential that governments, the business community, and scientists work together to develop renewable energy solutions for Arctic off-grid communities. There are several initiatives happening. In Longyearbyen, on Svalbard, the mining company Store Norske will use the knowledge and experience gained from more than a century of doing business in the Arctic to develop renewable energy solutions for off-grid communities. Their hope is to do this with local partners, and in a pilot project just outside Longyearbyen, they have already reduced diesel consumption by 40%, with a mix of wind, solar and geothermal energy, and with battery capacity for storage. The aim is to be diesel-free in the near future. And if we can make an off-grid energy solution work in the Arctic, it is likely then that we can make it work elsewhere as well. Dear friends, we can solve the problems we have created. History has shown us that. In these difficult and dangerous times, we all need to pull together as one, and European cooperation is more important than ever. I want to pay tribute to the leadership role the EU has taken on energy and climate issues. The EU is an important force for improved and ambitious policies in global meetings, such as the recent climate conference in Egypt and in the upcoming COP on biodiversity in Montreal. Together we need to find common ground with countries which we disagree with on many important issues, including human rights, but where we still need to work together to save our planet. Even though we could have wished for a more ambitious emission targets from COP27 in Egypt, the COP showed us that we are still able to make important progress in international meetings. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Haltbrekken, and thank you for your early involvement in acid rain issue and the ozone layer. I understood that there's ongoing challenges and that you believe that we can solve the climate issues, but through our international effort and collaboration with local initiatives, and you mentioned a few. Thank you for that. I now hand over to our second keynote speaker, Mrs. Gizem. There you are. She's Counsellor of and the Head of Section for Agriculture, Fisheries and Environment at the Mission of Canada and the EU. Ms. Eras, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Haltbrekken, for your great comments as well. So I'm very pleased to be here today at the Arctic Future Symposium. Je suis ravie de me joindre à ce symposium qui vise à favoriser d'importantes conversations sur l'Arctique, notamment sur l'évolution de la situation géopolitique et son impact sur l'avenir de la coopération arctique, et les communautés et la sécurité énergétique. So before speaking about Canada's approach to the Arctic, I want to address the current geopolitical challenges and complexities that risk undermining the history of peace and cooperation in the region. Canada condemns Russia's unjustifiable and flagrant actions in Ukraine, which are inconsistent with mutual trust and, together with respect for international law, have undermined the basis for Arctic cooperation and the work of the Arctic Council for decades. So we look forward to the effective transition to Norway's Arctic Council chairship and to moving ahead on projects and priorities for the future. The Arctic is central to Canada's national identity, to its prosperity, security, values, and interests as well. It covers more than 40% of our territory and is home to more than 140,000 inhabitants, over half of whom are Indigenous. Its rich history and culture are fundamental to Canada's social fabric as well. This rugged and natural area holds a wealth of resources and a vast range of biodiversity that thrive in both marine and terrestrial environments. These elements, with the influence of changing climate and increased activity in the region, will be the first to show the impacts of our decisions. We are committed to making policies and investments to ensure that northern communities, livelihoods, and ecosystems will continue to thrive. It is with our northernmost communities and partners that Canada is jointly implementing its Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, a roadmap to a future which envisions all Arctic and Northern communities as thriving, strong, and safe. Co-developed with federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous collaborators, Canada's Arctic policy reflects its circumpolar priorities, which in turn reflect the priorities of the people living in Canada's north. The Arctic Council remains the premier forum for Arctic cooperation. Though many of its projects are currently on pause as a result of Russia's flagrant actions, it is important that Arctic Council work continues where possible. Canada continues to champion the human dimension of the Council's work, including incorporation of Indigenous knowledge in science and research, and providing communities with practical knowledge and tools to support better decision-making. With the partial resumption of Arctic Council's working group projects that do not involve Russia, the Secretariat for the Arctic Council's Sustainable Development Working Group is being set up in Quebec City. This Sustainable Development Working Group will seek to increase the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and their engagement in the Council's work as well. Bilaterally, we're increasing collaboration with Arctic and key non-Arctic states and actors. This includes engagement with other Arctic states in key areas related to Indigenous issues, scientific cooperation, and environmental protection as well. We're also engaging on the Arctic with others to discuss issues of mutual interest, including with the EU. Canada is also resolving outstanding boundary issues in the Arctic region. Earlier this year, in accordance with international law, Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark signed a new boundary agreement resolving long-standing disputes over the maritime boundary in the Lincoln Sea and the sovereignty of the Tartupaluk and Hans Islands. This agreement delineated continental shelf for further cooperation in the Arctic, including culture, mobility and transport, natural resources, and sustainable development through trade and infrastructure. It is one such example of how a shared vision for future of the Arctic can be realized through the rules-based international order. Our Indigenous and Northern partners have told us nothing about us without us, and we are listening. Canada is seeking the advice of local and Indigenous experts in areas that have a direct impact on their communities. We have established marine protection areas with Indigenous knowledge and continue to go beyond simply consulting Northern partners to working in lockstep with them through project implementation. Through our Arctic policy, we seek to engage and enhance circumpolar and north-to-north connections among youth, as they will be the ones to move forward and collaborate to develop resilient and healthy communities. To this end, we are committed to providing Arctic and Northern youth with increased opportunities to participate in and benefit from Canada's international Arctic agenda. I must reinforce that the main challenge facing the Arctic and its people is not geopolitical posturing, it is climate change. Protecting biodiversity and ensuring the sustainable livelihoods of those who live there are key priorities for Canada. As today's discussion delves into future of Arctic cooperation, including with key non-Arctic partners such as the EU, let us also look to innovate ways to support sustainable development, address impacts of climate change, and protect biodiversity of the Arctic region. We must work together to ensure that the northernmost communities and people are able to thrive despite actions taking place elsewhere in the world. Le gouvernement du Canada demeure déterminé à poursuivre le dialogue sur l'Arctique avec tous les intervenants engagés et je suis heureuse de constater qu'un si grand nombre de nos collègues de l'Arctique et de l'Union européenne participent aux séances aujourd'hui et hier aussi. So I look forward to seeing the outcomes of the discussions over the 2 days. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Eras. A few things I remember this, your commitment to the northern communities and the ecosystems through the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. And then, as we heard yesterday as well, is your strong belief and support in the Arctic Council and multilateral collaboration, also something that comes back constantly, and the fact that nothing about us without us. I think that's how you summarized the necessity to involve, of course, Indigenous people. Thank you very much.